folks like me whose minds are operating on warp speed 24/7, how many times have people told you to slow down? Dude, slow down, take it easy, what's the rush, and so on and so on. A plethora of statements and phrases all meant to imply that you're just way too hyper. There must be something wrong with you. Maybe you need a prescription to curb that hyperactive enthusiasm of yours. No. How about you try to keep up? I'm so tired of society treating hyperactive brain cells as a freaking disease, diagnosing each overachieving synapse as some sort of dysfunctional ailment of the mind, an anomaly that must be corrected. Being quick, being smart is not a disease. Stupidity is. Stop trying to slow down those that mentally excel just because you and the rest of society can't keep up. Stop trying to medicate those mentally smarter and faster than you by labeling their intellectual hyperactivity as a disability. You're the disability. You're the one holding society back. And it's the vast majority of normies and static minds that are keeping the world from evolving. Because somehow, that no child left behind mentality turned into, hey kid, slow down, you're making the rest of us look bad. And everything has been geared towards the dumbest of society, not the smartest. So now, I'm supposed to limit my horizons just because you can't see beyond yours? No, I don't think so. I'm not doing that, and neither should you. If you can't keep up, hey, that's fine. Just don't hold back those who can excel. So, parents, teachers, if you see a kid who is utterly bored with your curriculum, that may not be ADD. It may be they're smarter than what you're trying to teach them. Find those minds and nurture them, for those are the minds that shall change the world. Doctors, physicians, psychiatrists. Making the mind of someone you deem out of the scope of the ordinary should be the last work with at times, but perhaps they can do what others nothing will. Smarter and faster than you by labeling their intellectual hyperactivity as a disability. You're the disability. You're the one holding society back. And it's the vast majority of normies and static minds that are keeping the world from evolving. Because somehow, that no child left behind mentality turned into, hey kid, slow down, you're making the rest of us look bad. And everything has been geared towards the dumbest of society, not the smartest. So now, I'm supposed to limit my horizons just because you can't see beyond yours? No, I don't think so. I'm not doing that, and neither should you. If you can't keep up, hey, that's fine. Just don't hold back those who can excel. So, parents, teachers, if you see a kid who is utterly bored with your curriculum, that may not be ADD. It may be they're smarter than what you're trying to teach them. Find those minds and nurture them, for those are the minds that shall change the world. Doctors, physicians, psychiatrists. Making the mind of someone you deem out of the scope of the ordinary should be the last thing you do, unless they're clinically nuts. No, stop dumbing down everyone with a prescription. Stop numbing the minds that are colorful palettes and turning them into bland and gray nothings. The world needs fast minds, free thinkers, critical and logical thinkers. And yeah, they may be difficult to work with at times, but perhaps they can do what others can't. Excel, if only given the opportunity. And you know, can you really blame them for being difficult? Yo, they've been held back way too long. So when they actually have an opportunity to excel, yeah, they may get a bit overzealous, annoying even. All you need to do.
Public domain, please excuse me. This live will be no less than 45 minutes. Thank you. We are continuing forward. If you can hear the sound of my voice, that means I've done my job.
They've been held back way too long. So when they actually have an opportunity to excel, yeah, they may get a bit overzealous, annoying even. All you need to do is point that focused energy in the right direction. And if you can't, get the hell out of the way. Stop trying to dull and mute their synapses just so they can better fit in with the type of society you, in your slow-paced perspective, deem to be normal. Because as I see it, society has become so bland, boring, and stupid, it's an embarrassing thing to be a part of, okay? Normal sucks. Look around. If this is normal, we need a little more abnormal. And for those who think I'm being a prick, hey, why do you think all the smart people are trying to go to space? They want to get away from you, and I don't blame them. Look around. Seriously, look around. Being a free thinker is now looked at as having a disorder. Going against the norm? Well, I guess you must have oppositional defiant disorder. You know what? You're damn right I do. Fight me, you dimwitted sack of crap. So, to the smart people out there, I know every time you try to rise up or break free, the vast majority of society goes out of their way to label your intellectual anomaly as some sort of ailment to be medicated away into submission. But you're smarter than that. Work around it. Hide it if you have to until you can find a place where you don't have to. And for those who don't know how evolution works, evolution is just a series of abnormal genetic mutations. It's what pushes a species forward. So, picture the mind as this prehistoric flightless bird that is just about to sprout wings. All society has been doing is clipping them. They're grounding them. They're keeping them tethered for yet another generation when they should be able to soar. Okay? Let these minds soar. They will make the world better, because the normies clearly have not. And yo, again, if you can't keep up, get the hell out of the way. One's mental acceleration and expansion shouldn't be halted by a sluggish speed bump that is the human race. Get out of the way. You are the problem. Smart people, stay smart. Work around it.
Okay, everybody, continuing forward. As I stated, the beginning of this live will be 45 minutes. If you can hear the sound of my voice, then I've done my job.
One useful way to organize our understanding of reality is to think in terms of things that are either very big, like stars and black holes, very small, like molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles, or very complex, aggregates of many particles that are highly ordered or structured. Tonight, we're going to focus on one of these three categories, the complex, the human brain. Now, it is not uncommon to hear the brain described as the most complex structure in the entire universe, but as we have such a meager knowledge of what might be out there, I, for one, am not ready to make that commitment, and there's no need to. The brain is complex, and its function is not just wondrous, but the very substrate of who we are as individuals and as a species, so the pull to understand the brain is strong. This program is called Decoding the Brain because the work of all the scientists we'll be speaking with in one way or another is contributing to a deeper understanding of the cascading electrical processes crackling through our brains, which somehow result in our experiences, our emotions, and our behaviors. In short, we will explore various ways that new tools that allow us to directly probe brain processes are helping to reveal that most complex of objects here on Earth, the human brain. Our Our first guest is Michael Halassa, who is the class of 1958 career development professor at MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences, and is also an associate investigator at MIT's McGovern Institute for Brain Research. His aim is to understand the basic architecture and the functional connections in the brain that underlie cognition, and he has identified basic circuit mechanisms for attention and decision-making. He joins us from his home outside of Boston. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
Our next guest is Edward Chang, who is the Joan and Sanford Weill Chairman of the Department of Neurological Surgery at the University of California, San Francisco. He co-directs the Center for Neural Engineering and Prostheses, which brings together engineers and neuroscientists to develop technology that can restore function to patients with neurological disabilities. He joins us from San Francisco. Welcome, Eddie.
Hi, Brian.
Once again, public domain. This is from the public domain. I've done my job.
Next guest is Michael Kahana, who is the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Term Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is the principal investigator at the university's Computational Memory Lab. He studies human episodic memory and is currently working on building a prosthetic device to enhance it. He joins us from his office in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Brian.
Welcome, Michael.
Happy to be here.
Our next guest is Helen Mayberg, who is the director of the Center of Advanced Circuit Therapeutics and a professor of neuroscience, neurology, neurosurgery, and psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She has done pioneering work to uncover the neural circuitry of depression and to treat it via deep brain stimulation. She joins us from her office in New York. Welcome, Helen.
Nice to be here, Brian.
Finally, we have Yuri Bujaki, who is the Biggs Professor of Neuroscience at New York University of Medicine. He is the author of The Brain from Inside Out, in which he proposes a new paradigm for the study of the brain, and he is currently decoding the underlying patterns by which the brain operates. He joins us from his office in New York. Welcome, Yuri.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you all for joining us. And let me start with a basic question that's really to the group. I'd love to hear all of you chime in if you have a perspective on it, which is this. Do any of you have a preferred metaphor for thinking about the working of the mind? And what do you think about the computer metaphor? Is it a reasonable way of thinking about the brain for some purposes, or is it a metaphor that should be retired? So maybe we'll begin with Eddie Chang.
From where I stand, it's actually very hard for me to think about the brain like a computer, because when I go to the operating room and see it every week, it doesn't look anything like a computer. Its substrate is fundamentally different, but we use the analogy all the time. And so in our work, it is helpful to frame some questions in terms of the information processing of the mind in the framework of a computer. But there's so much more that goes on that is generated from the internal model that's inside the mind, in the substrate of the brain, that is far beyond what modern computers do right now. In fact, I think the analogy for computers in the future might be more like the mind as opposed to the other way around.
Michael Halassa?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian, and I sort of echo what Eddie already mentioned. I should say that one of the things I think about quite a lot is the idea of scales in the brain, and this multi-scale organization and the vertical integration across these scales. And I think some of these scales, computer science can be extremely valuable in providing the language to describe them. I think what we're potentially lacking is vertically integrated theory to connect all of these scales in a way that would be helpful to connect them to real-world applications. So while the metaphor may work for certain scales at certain times, I think we're just missing a unifying theory for neuroscience to make sense of all of these ideas.
Sure. Helen, thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting because as a neurologist studying a psychiatric disorder like depression, one wanted to start with modules and to think about modular organization. But I think, like Michael says, thinking at different scales is really critical. And I think maybe the one metaphor of depression to this conversation is the nature of it feels like a black hole as kind of an attractor state. And as soon as you enter that metaphor into the conversation, the idea of a computer kind of quantifying that or giving us an organizational structure becomes a little tougher. So I'm really interested in how Yuri answers this question.
Well, that's a good lead in, Yuri.
Metaphors are useful, and we don't have anything else. The way how the brain works is it always compares. We know the unknown with the help of the known. So we always ground something that we don't understand with the help of something we think we do, such as a computer. And this is a useful metaphor, but we have a lot of other things that are blocking this. And the reason why we are thinking this way is because it's the computer world that took the initiative and says, oh, this is like the brain. And the reason why the computers and computer scientists think like about the brain is because they took the wrong brain model. And the wrong brain model is that the brain is a passive device, just like a computer, into which you shovel information, and the computer has no choice. The human mind doesn't have the choice. This is what's called the tabula rasa, or the blank slate model. And this is not by chance, that one of the giants of of AI and computer science, Alan Turing, explicitly said that the human brain is like a white paper onto which we have to prescribe things, and this is where we fill it up. Now, just by saying that, the real problem here is that if you follow this recipe from the brain, the AI, then the complexity of the human brain, of any brain, or the AI system depends on the amount of information you put in. And I can tell you later why I think it doesn't. So that's a fundamental difference. The brain is a self-organized system, whereas the computer is a man-made machine.
Right. Yeah, so we will have a time to discuss that in more detail a bit later on. But Michael Kahana, thoughts on the metaphors of choice for thinking about thinking?
Yeah, so those are all great points.
Public domain. Public domain. I've done my job. Also, we've already covered the subject of we're not slowing down more than what is required. So if you want to wait until the end of the lecture, video, lesson, etc., then you will have that answer again. So continuing forward, public domain, I've done my job.
And I love Yuri's point about a self-organizing system. The metaphor that got me interested in memory was from condensed matter theory, spin glass systems, or complex thermodynamic systems, where a system could be in multiple states. I mean, a simple example would be water. It could be solid, liquid, or gas, but even more complex systems exist in nature. And so that metaphor I found very appealing as a way of thinking about the brain differently from the computer analogy, and in line with the idea of a self-organizing system that Yuri mentioned.
With that as a preamble, let's jump in to some of the astounding, really remarkable work that you all have been pioneering. Eddie, I'm going to start with you. your focus, at least for some time, has been on understanding the neural circuitry of speech, with, I gather, one of the goals being to be able to have some sensors that can have some understanding of the electrical and other properties that are happening in the brain, and from those signals be able to get some understanding of what the patient is trying to say. So can you give us a sense of what your approach has been and what you have found?
Sure. So our approach has been to understand the neural code for our ability to articulate words and speak. And what I mean by that is the patterning of electrical activity that's generated by the brain activity in the temporal lobe and in the motor cortex that's above it. It's a very precise coordination of neural activity that gives rise to words and sentences. And so for the past decade, we've worked with patients of ours in San Francisco at the University of California, San Francisco, who have volunteered as part of medical treatments that they've had for treatment of their seizures when implanted electrodes were placed directly on the brain surface with very, very small sensors, maybe the ones you're referring to record that electrical activity at the order of millimeters and milliseconds. And with those kind of recordings, we've been able to decipher and correlate those electrical brain patterns with individual consonants and vowels, as well as syllables, in order to give rise to words.
So if I was one of those patients, you would ask me to imagine saying words and you'd monitor what goes on inside my head when I'm doing that?
Yeah, a lot of what we focused on actually was not so much about imagining speaking, but the actual production of words. So what I mean by that is when I'm speaking these words right now, how does the neural activity at one particular spot, about a millimeter wide, control the movements of my tongue in a very particular trajectory to create a duh sound, or the site that's right next to it that controls my lips when we make the sound buh. So there's a map that controls basically all of the very precise movements of the vocal tract. And we study that when people are speaking normally, but also in other conditions, for example, when they're imagining or sometimes even speaking different languages.
And is it important that you're getting the patient to actually say the words, the physical act of speech, as opposed to the mental act of imagining the word? Do those give radically different signals if you try to measure them?
Yeah, great question. We've looked at that pretty carefully, and it turns out that imagining speaking is very, very different than actually speaking. So the act of speaking is a fully intentional and volitional event, whereas when you're just thinking about a thought or even imagining the words, it's a different neural activity pattern that's much more subtle and complex, and that we have a lot more work to figure out how that works. But the actual production of words has become much more clear over the last 5 years.
And is it fairly consistent across distinct patients if everybody intends to articulate cat or ka, the same signal by and large is generated?
Yeah, that's right. So everyone has a little bit of variability in the absolute position of where these locations are in the brain, but they are confined to the sensory motor cortex of the part of the brain that controls the parts of our vocal tract. And when you look at the precise position of all of those neurons, it can be highly variable from one individual to another. But when you look at the patterns at a higher order, they're actually really remarkably similar.
And so do you have kind of like a dictionary or a map?
Yeah, both. Basically, it's a map of the different articulators of the vocal tract and the target sounds that we try to speak when we articulate words. And we call it a dictionary because, for example, in English, there's only about 40 phonemes, different speech sounds that give rise to every possible syllable and word. So a dictionary is a very useful way of thinking about it, is that you've got this elemental set of units that by themselves have no meaning, but in combination can give rise to every possible meaning.
So you basically just go through that exhaustive or fairly exhaustive list of elementary building blocks, map those out, and then you can stick them together, I gather, in your dictionary to generate more or less anything that somebody would say.
Yeah, exactly. And when you say exhaustive, something that's very important to think about that is just in the couple of minutes that we've already spoken, we've gone through most of that dictionary, not just once, but a couple of times. So just by simple conversation, just by simple speaking through random sentences even, you can sample all of this. And what's really incredible about it is that as people generate new sentences, we're resampling from that core dictionary, that core set of units, and recombining of ways to give rise to completely new meanings and sentences.
And then I presume then you can test this on new subjects and determine how well your system does at decoding the signatures in the brain that are being read through the implants.
Yeah, that's right. So we can essentially take that code and in the same person or in a different person with some modifications of that code, essentially translate that brain activity for a completely new sentence and reconstruct just from the brain activity alone what someone wanted to say or actually said.
And how well do you do?
I think we're starting to get to the point where things are starting to sound intelligible. So for example, if you wanted to translate brain activity into words and sentences that you actually hear with your ears using speech synthesis, using a machine algorithm to translate brain activity to actual sounds that you hear through speech synthesis, we're starting to get to the point where it's intelligible, which for us is a really important milestone. There's a lot of room for improvement, but where we are right now is that you can actually make out the words even though they're kind of fuzzy.
The proof that you're seeing.
Hello, everybody. Once again, because of public domain and all the rules, I have to pause, say a few words, unpause, etc. ... So I ensured to back it up this time because I paused at a point where whenever the computer voice starts talking, the first sentence that is said is vital. Okay, we can continue forward now.
And there's a lot of room for improvement, but where we are right now is that you can actually make out the words even though they're kind of fuzzy.
The proof that you're seeking is not available in books.
The proof that you are seeking is not available in books.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
So we're really excited in terms of achieving that milestone, yet there's still a lot more to do to make it better.
That's fascinating work, Eddie. Michael Kahana, let's turn to you. There's not a person among us who wouldn't love the prospect that we hear in sci-fi scenarios of one day being able to enhance our memories through some kind of medical intervention. And I know that you have begun work in that direction. So just to get us going, how well do we understand the process, the biological process by which memories are formed in the brain?
Well, I would say that we still are at a very, very early primitive stage in our understanding of the biological processes of the formation of memories, but we do have a very good ability to decode neural signals that predict whether or not memories will be stored and whether or not they will be accurately retrieved.
So you're treating the memory imprinting process as a kind of a black box, I guess, and saying, we don't really understand how it's happening in the brain, but we're just going to observe it and find the patterns. Do you feel that ultimately you're going to need to understand the process itself that's happening inside of our brains, or can we just treat it like that black box?
Well, I think that you need to proceed on multiple tracks. If you want to address the 1 in 12 Americans, for example, who have significant memory loss, then you want to move forward before you wait to have a full understanding or even a good approximate understanding of the underlying processes governing the storage and retrieval of memories. But I think that the most interesting process in the brain is the process by which we retrieve memories rather than the process by which we store memories, because memory retrieval, you might have a memory that's stored really well and you've experienced this thing many times, and you clearly, this memory pops into mind often, and then you find yourself in a situation where you need that information, you just can't find it, right? So something is going on, the memory is there. And if you just think about the fact that we walk around with vast stores of knowledge, of experience, of memories in our mind, and yet at any given moment, our ability to access that information is really quite limited, it makes you really wonder about the process of memory search. How do we search our memories? How do we retrieve them? And we can't just look at we can't go through the library and look at every index card. We need a mechanism by which to find those memories.
So tell us about the work that you've done in that regard, in trying to understand that in more detail, and also, I gather, in trying to develop approaches that might enhance the ability of an individual to retrieve those memories.
Well, so I think most of us wonder, why is one person's memory good and another person's memory is bad? Why can't I remember things the way I used to when I was much younger? But there is a fascinating paradox or mystery about memory, which is that within a given person, at a given time, let's say today, my memory is going to fluctuate between periods of better and worse function. There will be a dynamic process by which my memory varies in my ability to access those memories that I know, in my ability to create new memories. And we can prove with detailed experimental studies that that variability is not due to some unexplained external experimental factors, but it's something in the brain. It's something in my head that makes memory good at times and not good at other times. So now, if you can decode that physiologically, if you can use electrodes to measure electrical signals, the brain is after all an electrical network. If you can measure those electrical signals and forecast when you're going to have a memory lapse using the electrical signals recorded from the brain, then the idea would be that maybe you could make the brain look more like its best when it is at its worst. And so the idea is that if you first can decode or forecast this complex system that's varying, and then you can pinpoint the moments of a memory lapse and somehow coax or nudge the system from this worst state to this better state. The better state is a state that we know the brain can express, then perhaps you could meaningfully improve memory. And that's the kind of therapeutic approach that my team is taking.
And so are you working with human subjects and subjecting them to various memory tests and seeing when they're doing well and when they're not, and recording what's happening inside their head and building up the correlation in that way? Is that the approach?
That's exactly right. We have a patient who is undergoing the same kind of neurosurgical evaluation as what Dr. Eddie Chang described. We'll play, instead of playing games where they speak or listen to speech, they're going to play memory games in my work, and we'll track moments of good memory and moments of poor memory. And then we'll try to see whether we can build a mathematical model so that tomorrow, when we come back to the patient's bedside and they play the game, we can predict when their memory is going to be good and when it's not, moment to moment. And now, if that math.
So yeah, we're plenty enough ahead of time. As you notice, the video has 22 minutes and we're only 17 minutes live. So everybody sit back, take a breath. If need be, I'll ensure that we get 5 seconds back so that everybody can catch back up to where they was in dialogue. Once again, public domain. I have done my job.
Tomorrow, when we come back to the patient's bedside and they play the game, we can predict when their memory is going to be good and when it's not, moment to moment. And now, if that mathematical model is providing a reasonably accurate forecast prediction, we can now use very gentle electrical stimulation of the brain to try to coax the brain into a better memory state. And so what we do is we track those fluctuations in memory in real time. So we determine at any moment whether you're about to forget something or whether you're going to have trouble remembering something. And then we apply electrical stimulation at the moment when memory is predicted to fail, aligned with the kind of stimulation that would generally push it in the direction of a better forecast of good memory. And in that way, you can significantly improve memory in many patients.
How significant?
Well, it's variable from person to person. If you ask how significant in terms of percent memory improvement, it's about 19% improvement. In different studies, between 15 and 20%. In our latest work, 19.2%. If you ask, what does it mean for your memory to be 19.2% better? Like, what does that number mean, 19.2%? That is about half, a little bit more than half, of the deficit that would be incurred in a patient who had a moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. So in other words, that would be on average restoring half of the loss in memory in such a patient. And really what that means is that for, let's say, a third of the patients, it would be almost fully restoring that loss. For a third, it doesn't do anything. And for a third, it's about a half restoration of that loss of memory.
Fascinating. Let me move from that to Michael Halassa, who, Michael, you've been focusing, right? You've been focusing on trying to understand what it is to have attention, and whether, for instance, another metaphor that we certainly all use, which is kind of this spotlight of attention. That's the thing that the brain is illuminating. That's the thing that we're focused on. What have you learned? Is that a good metaphor for thinking about the things that hold our attention, or is there another view of awareness and attention that's emerged from your research?
So, Brian, I'm going to take a roundabout way to answer your question, having followed, Eddie and Michael Kahana in what they talked about. So, they talked about action, from Eddie's perspective, articulation, moving, and memory. And I think there is a case to be made that one of the primary purposes of having a brain is to plan our next action, right? Without the ability to move and act on the world, it makes no sense to have a brain in the first place. That's why plants don't have a brain. And as you go up in evolution, organisms that are better able to plan the sequences of their actions have bigger brains, have bigger internal models of how they control those actions over prolonged periods of time. And there's a temporal hierarchy there. And ultimately, they have a pretty good way of using these stored patterns of past inputs that we call memory, right? And my work has been on this sort of intermediate level of organization temporally speaking, between action, immediate action, and long-term memory, which is this idea of cognitive control, one of the aspects by which we control our cognition is through attention. How we prioritize incoming sensory information, how we filter them, and then how we sort of format them in a way that would be appropriate for both short-term and long-term action planning.
So we talk about making models of the world, which is vital, right? Because look, we're inundated by information all the time. I mean, right now I'm just sitting here in this theater, and the electromagnetic waves that are impinging on my eye, you've got these oscillating electric fields and magnetic fields trillions of times a second. If I was sensitive to even that information at that level of description, my brain would be overwhelmed, right? To trying to cope with that data. So what does the brain do to cope with this influx of information?
So I think that's a fascinating question. And I think it's helpful to, coming from MIT, I think it's helpful to invoke David Marr. Marr stipulated that we can think of the brain as we can think of a computer as, and I'm not saying the brain is a computer, I'm just saying this is a helpful metaphor for approximating the types of things that we do as neuroscientists to understand the brain. There's a computational level, that the high level objective that we're trying to accomplish for any particular neural process, the algorithmic level, which is what are the series of steps that the brain could take in order to sort of perform this computation, and then the implementational level, how is this actually implemented in neural hardware and spiking neurons, right? And for any particular neural operation, I think thinking about things in this particular way, in that sort of division is helpful. And understanding ultimately may be how we link these different levels of description to one another, where it becomes natural to talk about the algorithms of the mind implemented in neural hardware of spiking neurons. The work that we've done in my lab has focused on the implementation to the algorithmic level. So we record from individual spiking neurons in the brain in areas like the prefrontal cortex, this front part of the brain, and that's where we think a lot of cognitive control operations are generated. And the way by which we imagine they control things like what memory should we retrieve or what things should we pay attention to is by sending what we call these top-down instructions to downstream neural circuits to change their operation in such a way that we dampen the noise on the things that we don't care about, we amplify the signals on the things that we care about, and we retrieve the memories that we currently are looking for, we upload the memories that we care about, and so on.
Is it accurate to say that the brain then, from a hardware perspective, and perhaps an algorithmic perspective too, has kind of gatekeepers, that information is trying to make it up to the place of attention and awareness, but those gatekeepers are only letting some things through? Is that a reasonable way of thinking about it?
That's a great analogy, and I would say that it's not just in the domain of sensory systems. I would say that this is in the domain of cognition as well. I think that even, and I'm going to make sort of a conjecture here, that even when we are trying to retrieve generative hypotheses about what's going on in the world, I would say most people would be going through this filtering process in order to sort of maximize the likelihood of what's out there, right? I mean, these are statistical inference machinery that we have in our brain to infer what's going on in the outside world. And we have these things automatically running in the background all the time to arrive at the world as we see it out there. I think in certain disorders, for example, like psychosis, schizophrenia, et cetera, these kinds of inferential filtering mechanisms at the level of cognition are impaired. And that's why we end up seeing, I mean, again, this is my sort of leading hypothesis of what's going on in some of these illnesses, is that these filtering operations in that domain are impaired. And you end up with folks, and concluding that the FBI is after them, aliens are landing in their backyard, et cetera.
Fascinating. So Helen, we've seen a lot of discussion to this point regarding patterns in the brain that give us insight into words and speech, and Eddie Chang's work, insight into memory retrieval, Michael Kahana's work, issues of attention and awareness, gatekeeper aspects of the brain in Michael Halas's work. Your work is also, as I understand it, focused upon patterns in the brain, but your focus has been on the patterns that correspond to depression. So can you give us a sense of what that work has revealed? Is there a kind of uniform mental brain pattern that one can associate with that kind of an affective disorder?
So I think it's important first to kind of define the term. I mean, depression is really a very common and serious medical illness. And I'll make the argument that it's a brain illness. We can put people in scanners and we can get maps of what is the topography.
Public domain. By stating this, I don't even require the banner. I don't even need to state this, because whether you point at it or not, you're protected by whatever that copyright, etc. ... pseudoscience is. As long as I am doing this properly and stating that which is so, everything shall be done as such. Regards to Foamy the Squirrel, Ill Will Press, as well as the World Science Festival. Thank you very much for your generosity, gratitude, as well as intellectual conversation.
The functional topography of brain areas that are abnormal. And it turns out there's not just one spot, none of these complex systems, but even in these syndromes, if you have problems with mood and drive and thoughts and actions, it's no big surprise that you see multiple brain areas acting together, or actually not acting together, that are abnormal, and those can be mapped. And one can subsequently map how the dynamics of the brain changes with treatments. And our work on decoding, so to speak, or actually our use of causal manipulations in the brain, not just with medication or therapy, but in real time with electrodes, helps us to see that you can go from no capacity at all to within seconds, minutes, have a total shift of actually how you can see the outside world when you are stuck internalized.
Can you tell us a little bit more about exactly that? So if you have a patient who is depressed, clinically diagnosed as depressed, presumably the patterns of the brain are sufficiently recognizable that simply by looking at that data, you would recognize that that would be the appropriate diagnosis. Can you go that far in lining them up?
Well, I think that, we like to think so, that we work in groups of patients. Our team has taken the approach of diagnose depression by standard of practice, throw people in a scanner, take a resting state picture of the brain, treat people with different kinds of treatments for 3 months. You're either well or you're not. Go back to the beginning and see if you can tell the difference of how people responded. it's working now that you can start to look at an individual patient to make a decision about which way to treat. And we and others are trying to look at that kind of treatment-specific biomarker, but it's the same network in the brain, but in different states. So the question is every patient different? Or is there one pattern? There's not one pattern because we don't know what the instigator is of depression. And by the time a patient is ill, there are many maladaptive patterns that you're seeing. And so you're really trying to wade through all of this noise to get at the kernel that might be helpful. And at that point, as Yuri said, the self-organizing system is totally self-organized to try to adapt. And now you actually have to figure out what are the state you're in. You're now lost. So how do you take someone lost and figure out what you can do to move them back into a place where they can retrain and be found? And that's really, it's become much more clear in our work with implants, what that really means. That was harder to see when people were less sick.
So with the implants, and you mentioned this really stunning result of in minutes, you mentioned sometimes you can see a change in a person. Just tell us a little bit about that. How were you stimulating that person? Was it through some kind of electrode in the brain? And what was the response like in some of these remarkable cases?
So there have been many now. So I started this 15 years ago in Toronto with a team, a neurosurgery team, Anders Lozano, Sid Kennedy, a psychiatrist. We basically took the hypothesis based on this imaging, on this map that we had that really told us there were brain areas that were working together, but their synchrony was dysregulated. And we basically had reason to believe that one area deep in the brain seemed to be the ringleader. It was really focused, the subcallosal cingulate. It's connections to midline thalamus, like Michael talks about. It's connections to the hippocampus that Mike Kahana talks about. It's connections to the frontal cortex, to the hypothalamus, to other parts of the brainstem. It seemed to be focused in a place that if it didn't change, it wreaked havoc on everything else. We didn't take epilepsy patients. We took depressed people who had failed multiple drugs, psychotherapy, electroconvulsive shock therapy. They're pretty much at the end of the line. They were in that attractor state. They are stuck and they can't get out. And we basically said, can we leverage the technology that's used in Parkinson's, implant with anatomical precision in this area and in the white matter that connects it to these other areas in this putative circuit? And actually, when we
Public domain, public domain. Also, I wonder if people can even hear me. I think they can. I think they can. Yes, they can. So this does work. Also, pineal gland. Pineal gland. And you see they're talking about the thalamus a lot. Yeah, the thalamus. That's the big ass long H word that you're going to see in a little bit. With that thalamus, that big ass long H word and thalamus, yeah, that means pineal gland. Bridging the gap. Bridging the gap. Bridging the gap.
precision in this area and in the white matter that connects it to these other areas in this putative circuit. And actually, when we stimulate at high frequency, it's like we release the lockdown of this region and people kind of come out of it. So as we got better and better at it with our imaging, we can plan a surgery precisely within millimeters, place it at this convergence of these multiple pathways that we know interact with each other. And we know that from animal studies, we know that from epilepsy studies. And when we apply the high frequency stimulation, we can predict that someone will emerge. And what they describe is that the negative turns off and it's as though they kind of come back online. They can pay attention, they feel connected, they feel like they can move. So the paralysis kind of goes away. And that happens very rapidly. And if you give the stimulation, even in the operating room, 10, 15 minutes so that we can record and actually see what happens. We leave the operating room and they'll stay well, several weeks without further stim. And then we actually turn it on and give stimulation. And we have patients that have these chronic implants, have this pacemaker on all the time, and people are better and go about their business so that we've reset something very fast. And then we've allowed the brain, again, I'll use this self-organizing principle, to relearn who you are with a brain that doesn't get stuck.
Yeah, that's remarkable, Helen, that a little electrical nudge at the right spot in the brain can have such a dramatic long-term effect. Now, Michael Kahana, you've also found that the right electrical nudge can have a big impact, elevating the capacity of patients to retrieve memories. So, Michael, when you add these tiny little electrical impulses to the brain, I'm assuming the patient doesn't feel it. They only feel the repercussions of that stimulation. So this is truly, you are manipulating the brain. The patient doesn't know when you're doing it, but yet they will show a difference on these memory exams that shows a marked difference from before and after.
What we do is we apply stimulation, these stimulation protocols randomly on certain lists. So certain memory games, the game might be like 30 seconds or a minute trial with or without. The patient doesn't know, the experimenter doesn't know, and that's how we gauge the beneficial effects.
And so do you think that the ability to read these signals and even to manipulate these signals, which is what you're doing now, will this ultimately lead to a full understanding of the process of memory retrieval? And I would love to memory formation as well. Is this the route toward that goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really critical question that we want to know the answer to. Meaning, if you have people, let's assume that we can create a therapy whose benefit is sufficiently meaningful that many people who need the therapy will get the therapy, and the risk is low and the benefit is high. And now you have people walking around with devices that decode variable memory states in the brain and transmit those signals encrypted to a cloud, which is able to analyze those signals and build up a massive database of information about how the brain operates when you're studying and recalling information, or even just doing your regular activities of daily life. Once you have that massive database, you can imagine that you could begin to test theories out and improve and refine theories, much like maybe the Hubble telescope or some other devices give you insights into the cosmos. This kind of technology could give us tremendous insights into an understanding of memory encoding and memory retrieval.
Eddie, the technology you've developed synthesizes speech based on the intention to form words. Have you applied this in situations when the individual is speech impaired for some reason? Has it been able to work in those circumstances?
Right. Well, that's a great question. So for the past 5 years, 10 years, we've really focused on what that basic science, that basic neuroscience of this code for all of the different consonants and vowels and movements of the vocal tract that give rise to speech. And about 2 years ago, because of the results of that foundational work, we started a clinical trial, actually called the Bravo trial, in which we enrolled the first participant. It was a young gentleman who, at the time when he enrolled in the study, was 35 years old. And the reason he was a participant in the study was that 15 years ago, he was in a car accident that led to complications of a brainstem stroke. with the inability to move his arms and legs, as well as to speak. And
so we sit here because we must, and this is actually an extremely longer break than what we always have. Yet I will ensure that you don't have to look at the face, the buffer face, as we sit here for a moment and wonder what they're talking about, because some people are still trying to catch up because slowdown was inferred with before the beginning of the show. As we sit back, enjoy, and relax, wondering who is the other eye in the woods or the ear in the cornfield. Hello there. Hello there, individual. How are you? You are noticed. You have been acknowledged. We've expressed an abundance amount of time as we sit here awaiting the long break, staying within all the terms of public domain, allowed use, educational purposes. It's fine. You can remain in the background. Don't care. But know that you are known. Back to the show. Everybody dance. Everybody clap. Here we go now. Here we go now.
So for us, that was a very important development in the last 2 years to move a lot of what we had studied in the context of people who are normally speaking to a clinical context in the situation of someone who's fully paralyzed, who has the full capacity and intent to speak in the cerebrum, in the cerebral cortex, but couldn't because of a disconnection in the brainstem. And we were able to translate that brain activity into full words. The proof of principle is there, and that it is possible to really leverage that rich information of those patterns of neural activity to give rise to things that are so human and so intimate, like words and speech.
That's fascinating work. Michael Halassa, unlike Eddie and Helen and Mike Ahana, I understand that you work primarily with animals rather than with humans. So how do you go about that?
So we train them on.
So yeah, we've had a break, we've had a moment, and here we roll again. Public domain.
Decision-making tasks in which they need to retrieve a reward. It's what we call alternative choice tasks. So and we do it trial by trial. So on every trial, we give the animal the option of choosing between two options, and the animal is required to do this based on appropriately deploying attention. So on every trial, for example, it gets a visual or an auditory target, and it has to pick the appropriate one. We train it to be sensitive to a cue beforehand. So we cue it on every trial, and we can make that cue sort of ambiguous. So basically, we can make this process of attention a decision-making process, decide what to pay attention to based on ambiguous input. And that allows us to study how the brain decides to what to pay attention to, and both the filtering at the level of the cognitive operation and the filtering at the level of the sensory operation.
And those animals, typically, is that mice or dogs or cats?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we have published so far are in mice. And the reason why we choose mice is because they are they're mechanistically tractable. We can go in and turn circuits on and off using a technology called optogenetics, and we can talk about that later. And then in more recent studies, we've been using this organism called the tree shrew, Tupaya, and that's an organism that's sort of intermediate between rodents and primates, and that allows us the same kind of mechanistic accessibility, but we can achieve high-level cognition and study things like causal inference in these animals.
If schizophrenia, for instance, aligns with the theoretical description that you're imagining, somehow the gatekeeper not doing its work, does that suggest a particular treatment or course of action, or is it too early for that kind of a diagnostic?
I can tell you where my intuition comes from. So my intuition comes from studying a particular circuit from the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, which is particularly developed in humans, and its connection to a structure called the medial dorsal thalamus, the part of the thalamus.
Or the pineal gland. Once again, this is the crazy-ass long M word with thalamus. Pineal gland. Public domain, public domain. This is known as the pineal gland. Notice how it's roughly raisin size? Yeah. This is your crown chakra. Wow. Bridging the gap. Continue.
Or a central structure in the brain. In schizophrenia patients, those connections, the structural integrity of these connections are impaired, and that's been known for a long time. In my lab and others in the community, we've been studying this particular network in and that's been known for a long time. in my lab and others in the community, we've been studying this particular network in
Oh, sorry. I just realized my microphone was muted. Ah, that's fun. So, here's the real question.
thalamus.
Essential structure of the brain.
Okay, so we see the pineal gland. We see the electronical pulses connected to the prefrontal cortex. My question to the audience member sitting in the back is it considered an impairment if the pineal gland is charging the entire brain instead of just one singular area? Continue.
In schizophrenia patients, those connections, the structural integrity of these connections are impaired, and that's been known for a long time. In my lab and others in the community, we've been studying this particular network in animals, and what we've been finding is that a lot of these cognitive filtering operations, sort of deciding which evidence you should use in order to deploy your attention, goes through those circuits. Almost the algorithm is going through different refresh cycles between these two structures, and in that process, the thalamus really acts as a filter for how reliable the information that you're getting is. So the sort of the idea that patients and animals, when we impair those, when we inhibit those connections, end up jumping to unlikely conclusions, basically leads us to conclude that this is a reasonable hypothesis to have about these impaired inferential mechanisms in schizophrenia.
Yuri, so we've heard from a lot of researchers, the 4 researchers on the discussion here tonight. Eddie talking about looking at the brain, finding the patterns that decodes to language, the Michaels on memory and attention, Helen on other patterns that allow us to understand aspects of depression.
Public domain. This is the reason why I am slowing down a hair is because this individual all the way to the right has a slight accent, and I'm catering to the needs of more than even myself at this moment in time.
And even have suggested ways to address that situation that have been remarkably effective. All of that, I believe you would describe as the outside-in approach to understanding the brain. We as third-party observers, we objective scientists are studying some aspect of patterns inside the brain, and with that third-party perspective, trying to do something to the brain in order to get the pattern to change or to read the pattern or to do something with the pattern. I gather your view is that, yes, this is profound work, but I think that you suggest that there's another way of thinking about it that ultimately you think is the way forward. Give us a sense of what that is.
Historically, research in the brain or on the brain has been working its way in from the outside world, hoping that such systematic approach will take us to the middle and on through the middle to the output, which is the action. Now, of course, people didn't start out as neuroscientists. Early thinkers were thinking about the importance of psyche, the soul, the mind, and so on. And they were speculating. And that speculation was codified by Christian philosophers and then the British empiricists. The bottom line of all of this is that the human brains are there to learn the truth of the world that is outside in its entity and its beauty. And in the process, we realized that we need to explain various things. And so we made up terms such as attention, memory, decision-making, creativity, imagination, scratchpad memory, working memory, and I can go on and on and on and on. There are many, many, many words. So when neuroscience entered the scene, it seemed that we already have a task. We are on the right road. We have a roadmap, what we have to do, namely to find homes to all of these terms and see how they work. I think you agree with me that this is a naive approach, because those boundaries that we made up in our minds and those boundaries that smart people 1,000 years ago, hundreds of years ago, they made up as a term, cannot really have a mechanism with the same boundaries inside the brain. Now, just to give you an example, this is this outside-in approach is also used to be called the tabula rasa or the blank slate model and so on, with the understanding that you just have to shovel knowledge into the brain because the brain is a receiver that is there ready to absorb all the information that comes from outside. So, for example, when we inspect an elephant, which has a shape, size, smell, and so on, then the goal is to figure out how the brain combines or binds those attributes into a representation or into a symbol, and it becomes a symbol of the elephant. There is a fundamental problem with this approach, which is the attributes of the elephant, or of any object for that sake, is not in the object. Those attributes are made by the brain. So that's where we are right now. We are at what I can call a blind alley, and we are trying to find our way out from this blind alley.
So what do you think is the way out? I mean, I'm not sure that everybody would agree, so I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but if one agrees that this is a blind alley, what do you think is the way forward? What are we missing? Is it a radical change of perspective? Do you just need to add something to the mix in order to have a more complete framework?
Well, an alternative, what I call the brain-centric view, the one I'm promoting, is that we learn from our actions. The task of the brain, if there is a task, evolutionary task, is to serve the body, and the consequences predict the consequences of our actions. Now, let me explain the difference between the two frameworks in practical neuroscience terms. So what we have been doing for decades is that we present something to the brain, be it an experimental animal or a human brain, and we record.
So yeah, this is being recorded, so I do have to do the polite thing and ensure to say public domain and start again.
From inside the brain, and it could be an electrical pulse that we are picking up in Michael Kahana's lab, or it could be a bolt signal that imagers get. And then we correlate the two, and then we say, oh, well, there's a nice correlation between a moving pattern and the neurons firing a particular way in the visual cortex, for example. We can go further on, and Eddie showed a very nice example that we can train a computational algorithm. We say, we make these systems smart. It's so smart that now we can reverse the process. We are recording from brain activity, and from the previous learning, we can reconstruct what would be, for example, the music, what would be the language from the brain patterns. There is a catch here. The catch is that the experimenter is in a privileged situation. Only the experimenter has access to the world outside there and the activity of the brain inside here. Neurons in the brain have no clue what's going on in the outside world. Neurons will just get action potentials from their partners, and they have no clue whether those action potentials mean anything outside. In other words, this approach does have no grounding. As I mentioned, grounding is a process where the unknown is grounded to the known. And there is only one source of knowledge that neurons can have besides what's coming in from the outside world, and this is action or output. Now, action, of course, is a typical way you think you are moving your arms, or you moving your eyes, or do something like that. But action is also the action on your heart, the action on your endocrine system, and thought is also an action. Now, the good news is that every action system in the brain informs, it sends out an output not only to the body, but it also informs the rest of the brain that I have sent out an output. Now, neurons in the visual cortex, for example, can deal with two types of information. One is that is coming from outside, the one is coming from here. So this is the way, and the only way, how I can say that I am the actor, I am the agent of my own actions. So this is a fundamental difference between the two approaches. And I would say, let me give you an example. No amount of stirring a stick in water, or no amount of argument between you and me, we would agree that the stick is broken or not. But a little movement, a little action there, immediately will reveal to the brain that the stick is not broken. The source of knowledge in the traditional outside-in model is the assumed richness of the world, waiting to be observed by a camera-like brain.
Yep, public domain. We've arrived at, once again, a moment where I have to say public domain. Continuing forward, I'll back up a hair.
Is the assumed richness of the world, waiting to be observed by a camera-like brain. In contrast, in the inside-out framework, knowledge comes from action-based exploration, and everything is compared and valued from the organism's point of view. No exploration, no knowledge.
So I gather, and apologies if this is a coarse summary, but you want to kind of close the loop where the brain does receive stimuli from the external world, but it also acts on the external world, which then affects the stimuli we receive from the external world. And it's this loop of information that is required for the brain to have grounding, for it to know that there's an external world, to know what these neural firings are actually corresponding to in the external sense. But what is the definition of action? And I ask for the following reason. So as you noted, action in the most straightforward is just moving the arms and the legs and so forth. But you also mentioned it can be the action of one neuron sending an outward signal within the brain itself. So can action be a completely inner process, or does it need to access the external world?
Doesn't have to need to have any access to the external world. I'll give you an example. When you are born, before you are born, we all kick. The baby kicks are very, very important. And the baby kicks correlate with the Apgar score and the intelligence quotient 20 years later. So they're very important. What they do is help the brain to build a body map. And it's a very fascinating mechanism, namely that every single time there is this dumb teacher that some muscle activity is there, it sends back a signal to the future sensory, somatosensory representation. Now, of course, this is not a random process because the skeletal system confines how those muscles can move. So now the agonist and the antagonist are represented together in time when I happen to move my left arm or I happen to move my finger as a baby or as a fetus. And those timing effects, because their proximity in time, they allow that neurons, when they grow in, they will make the connections appropriately. So this is how we make a map of the body, and we build it up and update it every day because every week the distance between your finger and your nose it varies. So it has to be updated. So this is an example of how an action system can teach and make sensation meaningful. No amount of sensation. You can have your camera, your eyes, everything, and you can give any amount of information through sensors to a robot. That robot just remains dumb. Without testing the distance between me and the tree and between me and the mountain, I have no clue whether the mountain is bigger or smaller than the tree. So only through this action-based calibration can sensation make sense?
So I just want to
So, yeah, public domain. Public domain. Hello, everybody. Public domain. Here we roll.
And the tree. Only through this action-based calibration can sensation make sense.
So I just want to comment on that because, again, it's observation from the patients. But despite the fact that I described this shift from a total internal focus in these depressed patients to the capacity to interact outside themselves and to get the feedback. And what we see over time is exactly what Yuri is talking about. It takes time to recalibrate one's own internal body and its relationship to the outside world. And you're watching over months. We actually saw a patient for a 10-year follow-up last week who, when she tried to describe in retrospect every stage of recovery, she was realizing that updating her own external internal map had been an ongoing process. And that when she tried to identify, yeah, she remembered in the operating room, but that was minor compared to actually taking a year or two to really trust her representation of her internal state, the outside world, and to feel that there was dynamical predictions that she could make and learn. And so I'm a fan of how Yuri is conceptualizing it, even if at the neuron to neuron level, we have no idea. But the metaphors that patients use, the experience that they have, is there is no depression per se. It's just the absence of capacity to do those ongoing updates that probably is how we should really look at what we see.
So let me jump off from that to one final question as we're running out of time here. I want to go back to Eddie Chang, and a question that I'll ask Eddie, but one that I'd like you all to weigh in on if you have a perspective on it. Eddie, you noted that you go into the operating room and you look at the brain itself, and you know that it's more than a computer, right? You're not looking at a motherboard with chips. It's something beyond a computer. But from your years of staring at the brain and manipulating the brain and trying to decode the brain, where do you come down on the question that, of course, has been kicked around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is consciousness, right? We really haven't spoken about consciousness here, and some of you may roll your eyes at the idea of consciousness, and if that's your response, I'll be happy to hear it. But when it comes to consciousness, is it within this physical structure? Is that all that there is? Or do you find that it's even inadequate for that purpose, that you think there has to be something beyond the physical in order for us to have the kinds of inner worlds that happen inside of our heads?
Yeah, Brian, thanks for asking that question. And from a physician's perspective, we think about consciousness in fairly concrete terms in terms of whether someone is awake or not awake. There's some very, very important medical definitions that we use to define consciousness, and there are specific parts of the brain, for example, the brainstem and the thalamus, the areas that Michael Halassa studies very intensely, and how they interact with the cortex, that need to be intact in order to have conscious awareness. There's a lot of other aspects of conscious awareness and subjective perception and our appreciation of the environment and that kind of awareness. But in terms of the basic fundamental idea of being awake versus asleep, from my understanding, the way I see it is that it's an emergent property that results from the interactions of some very, very core structures in the brain, including the thalamus and other subcortical areas. You can see that when people have brain injuries in some of these areas, they may never fully wake up from those strokes or traumatic brain injuries, where in other parts of the brain, there's no effect whatsoever, even that you can detect in many cases. So the location, the substrate, the hardware is very fundamental to this. The operation, implementation of how the neurons in these particular brain locations give rise to conscious awareness is a fascinating question that a lot of people are working on now, and it's very much related to all of our work.
Michael Halassa, how about your views? Consciousness purely physical, something else? Will a computer ever be able to have the kind of inner worlds that we do?
I mean, I think it's a great question.
Public domain. Hello. I noticed that our viewer has left. Unsure of why, but we will be continuing forward.
Brian, I think you mean by consciousness, you mean phenomenal consciousness, the experience of.
I mean, the thing that's happening right between my ears right now.
Yeah, what it is to be me, what is it to have a perspective, what is it to have, the redness of red, the qualitative experience of the outside world. I mean, I think we're missing something really fundamental in our description of science altogether to be able to arrive at an answer to the question, will a computer have consciousness or not? Does an ant have consciousness? Does anybody else other than me have consciousness? I think we just don't know. I mean, we don't really have the theoretical framework to be able to answer a question of this nature. I mean, I'd like to think that other people other than me do have an internal experience and do see green and red in ways that are similar to me. And by extension, I can imagine dogs and cats doing the same thing. And I do believe fundamentally that the brain is generating processes that can be approximated in artificial in machines. And therefore, I don't see a reason why machines won't be able to experience things that are similar to that. But again, I can't tell you how.
Yeah. Helen, any thoughts on the physical basis of conscious awareness versus something else?
The short answer is no. And I think, these are surrogate discussions. And when we have a readout, I'm not even sure that we would know that that's what we're talking about. But I'll leave that to philosophers and neuroscientists that think they're studying it.
Yuri?
Public domain, public domain.
The dream that we dream together is reality. So that's a nice metaphor, and we can go this way. But you ask concrete questions, whether my consciousness, that is Brian's consciousness, has something to do with your brain and only with the brain. My answer is definitely no. And this is a connection between the computer and your brain. And your eyes are rolling now, I can see. Your brain is calibrated not by the physical world only, but also by my brain and brains of many, 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 many others. So this reflection of your actions back to you or back to the brain is what gives rise to something that we are talking about. And of course, you can ask also whether computers can have it. Well, right now what we do is all that information that we give to the computers, usually there's one. Computers don't, or robots don't communicate with each other. So it's an unfair comparison between a few billion people's knowledge compared to one or few machines that thousands and thousands of people put together. The competition or the real thing would be that we have at least 1 million robots running around in the world, and they would team up against us, and then would they collaborate and things like that. That's where we would talk about the funny part, whether we could be outsmarted or not.
Right.
So basically what I understood from that, once again, public domain, what I understood from that is exactly what I've been trying to collaborate and extend towards other individuals. Back to you now. That's the point. It's not going to take one of us. It's going to take every one of us. Public domain.
Michael Kahn, I'm giving you the last word. Consciousness. Anything you want to share?
Yeah,
Thoughts?
I think that the most interesting things that the brain does are the things that it's not consciously aware of. It's all that stuff behind the veil of consciousness that is working in the background, and that may underlie, for example, why somebody might ultimately become depressed, right? Or why their memories of events that happened long ago are doing stuff to affect their future behavior. They're not even aware of it. I think we want to understand all of that stuff, the inside stuff that sometimes doesn't come out immediately, but may come out at an inopportune moment. I'd really like to understand those processes.
Well, I just like to reiterate what Michael Kahn said, and several of you, that what is me? Me is my memories. If you take away my memories, am I aware of my surroundings? God knows, it's kind of you are a zombie. You can react, and it's hard to tell whether you are the same Brian than 5 minutes ago. But without your past, you cannot have that kind of consciousness that philosophers are talking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, the fact that collections of particles can hold on to a lifetime of memories, as we were talking before, giving us a consistent identity through time, is, of course, the essence of what it means to be human. So from this human being to you 5 human beings, from these brain patterns to yours, I thank you so much for this conversation on the brain. It was deeply fascinating and illuminating. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, public domain, and this addresses the issue of exactly what you may have perceived a problem with if your due diligence integrity was too low. Please continue, our overlord and master, Foamy the Squirrel.
For folks like me whose minds are operating on warp speed 24/7, how many times have people told you to slow down? Dude, slow down, take it easy, what's the rush, and so on and so on. A plethora of statements and phrases all meant to imply that you're just way too hyper. There must be something wrong with you. Maybe you need a prescription to curb that hyperactive enthusiasm of yours. No. How about you try to keep up? I'm so tired of society treating hyperactive brain cells as a freaking disease, diagnosing each overachieving synapse as some sort of dysfunctional ailment of the mind, an anomaly that must be corrected. Being quick, being smart is not a disease. Stupidity is. Stop trying to slow down those that mentally excel just because you and the rest of society can't keep up. Stop trying to make it those mentally smarter and faster than you by labeling their intellectual hyperactivity as a disability. You're the disability. You're the one holding society back. And it's the vast majority of normies and static minds that are keeping the world from evolving. Because somehow, that no child left behind mentality turned into, hey kid, slow down, you're making the rest of us look bad. And everything has been geared towards the dumbest of society, not the smartest. So now, I'm supposed to limit my horizons just because you can't see beyond yours? No, I don't think so. I'm not doing that. And neither should you. If you can't keep up, hey, that's fine. Just don't hold back those who can't excel. So, parents, teachers, if you see a kid who is utterly bored with your curriculum, that may not be ADD. It may be they're smarter than what you're trying to teach them. Find those minds and nurture them, for those are the minds that shall change the world. Doctors, physicians, psychiatrists. Medicating the mind of someone you deem out of the scope of the ordinary should be the last thing you do, unless they're clinically nuts. No, stop dumbing down everyone with a prescription. Stop numbing the minds that are colorful palettes and turning them into bland and gray nothings. The world needs fast minds, free thinkers, critical and logical thinkers. And yeah, they may be difficult to work with at times, but perhaps they can do what others can't. Excel, if only given the opportunity. And no, can you really blame them for being difficult? No, they've been held back way too long. So when they actually have an opportunity to excel, yeah, they may get a bit overzealous, annoying even. All you need to do is point that focused energy in the right direction. And if you can't, get the hell out of the way. Stop trying to dull and mute their synapses just so they can better fit in with the type of society you, in your slow-paced perspective, deem to be normal. Because as I see it, society has become so bland, boring, and stupid, it's an embarrassing thing to be a part of, okay? Normal sucks. Look around. If this is normal, we need a little more abnormal. And for those who think I'm being a prick, hey, why do you think all the smart people are trying to go to space? They want to get away from you, and I don't blame them. Look around. Seriously, look around. Being a free thinker is now looked at as having a disorder. Going against the norm? Well, I guess you must have oppositional defiant disorder. You know what? You're damn right I do. Fight me, you dimwit sack of crap. So, to the smart people out there, I know every time you try to rise up or break free, the vast majority of society goes out of their way to label your intellectual anomaly as some sort of ailment to be medicated away into submission. But you're smarter than that. Work around it. Fight it if you have to until you can find a place where you don't have to. And for those who don't know how evolution works, evolution is just a series of abnormal genetic mutations. It's what pushes a species forward. So, picture the mind as this prehistoric flightless bird that is just about to sprout wings. All society has been doing is clipping them. They're grounding them. They're keeping them tethered for yet another generation when they should be able to soar. Okay? Let these minds soar. They will make the world better. Because the normies clearly have not. And no, again, if you can't keep up, get the hell out of the way. One's mental acceleration and expansion shouldn't be halted by the sluggish speed bump that is the human race. Get out of the way. You are the problem. Smart people, stay smart, work around it.
Hello, everybody. This is the Morning with Zero. Everybody has access to the show now. Give me another moment and we'll spit around. And we will be right with you.
Media minds. Media used to be kind of a bunch of straight lines. You had your major networks and all that, usually reporting on events with some reasonable sense of credibility. Then you had your couple of wavy lines, like tabloids and similar salacious content that were more for speculative entertainment than actual news. Tall tales of Batboy and Bigfoot marrying the Pope in secret. You kind of knew what was real and what was just garbage. Where once media was a few straight lines and a couple of wavy ones of infotainment, now the internet has made media consumption a giant spaghetti monster of misinformation, speculation, and hearsay brought to you by not news outlets, but Twitter users and YouTubers and other high-profile social media personalities who are more concerned with views and likes than facts. Now, your job, in an effort to get any credible information, is to try to untangle the half-truths and lies and attempt to validate a multitude of sources claimed to be true by various outlets. It's a difficult job to uncover the truth, and I understand why no one bothers to do it anymore. Because how many of you out there sat through a YouTube video for 10 minutes that claimed some breaking news just in something or other, or you would not believe what blah 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 said, did, or was seen where nonsense, only to be bombarded with ads and inevitably tabbing away with no real credible information? You were played, they worked your mind, and piqued that curiosity. They know the words to use. It's a formula. You would not believe, fill in the blank title. Could this one item change your life? Did this thing live up to the hype? Blah blah blah, revealed, etc., etc. Titles like these are used to poke at the inquisitive part of your brain, that part that needs to know, that fear of missing out. You're not missing out. Everyone else is. Huh? What? All right, listen. Smarter folks out there will recognize this pattern and just opt out of the clickbait crap, move on, and do something with their life. They'll use that time for something better. Everyone else who doesn't want to miss out, they're the ones wasting 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and so on, and it all adds up. And before you know it, you've spent years on VODs that have told you nothing. They barely even entertained. You're wasting time. Now, for those on the fence, those who have that fear of missing out, you have a chance to move past this garbage, the hate, the clickbait, the divisive conversations meant to drive engagement, the mental manipulation by YouTubers and streamers and mock news reporters, all there to waste your time. Time is money, and they're wasting yours and getting paid for it. If you're fine with that, good for you. Enjoy. I can't help you. Everyone else, go. Run. Detach yourself from all this nonsense. But I'll miss out! Okay, here's the world for the next 50 years. One group of people hates another group. One country hates another country. True equality will never exist due to human ego. Opposing political parties are forever at odds. Sports fans hate the other team and their fans. A new movie was released which was underwhelming. Another franchise has been rebooted yet again. Video game news that will inevitably get to you anyway. Clothes and fashions go through a 20-year cycle. Hold on to your flannel. Hot new tech has just been released which will be out of date in 6 months. Wait. The environment is being destroyed, but humans keep having kids, perpetuating yet another generation of consumption. People care about the environment as long as it's convenient. A random cause of the week is popular, so everyone will virtue signal, pretending they care until the next cause is popular. Give it a week or so. Whatever you're doing, someone will criticize. And a random natural disaster and celebrity scandal to round things out. This is the world, and it will be, because it always has been. Humans do not change, and it will continue forever and ever. It is all just noise. Let it go. Whatever you miss out on, no one is going to care about in a week. It's not trending anymore. It doesn't generate views, but people got invested in it, stressed themselves out, and made their mental state just a little more unstable. And for what? So they can say they were trending for 2 minutes? Good job. I spent that week creating, absorbing the arts, talking with humans in real life who weren't hindered with social media baggage, having real conversation, making people laugh and think about more important things than the top 5 things you should be doing right now to fix your mental health. You only need one, and that's to take a few steps back from a species whose self-proclaimed intelligence and wokeness is laughably juvenile and woefully misguided. And as much as I like a good joke, humanity is just a joke that's not funny anymore. It's just cringe. Save yourself. Let it go. Don't you know you can let it go and go do something better with your time? Even if you don't want to watch this, I totally understand. Go do something more productive now that you got the knowledge that you should be doing something more productive than watching this. Go! Do something better.
Hi everybody, Squidward here. How are y'all? As we wait for the live to catch up with itself, we're sitting here, looking around. The StreamYard is down there. We accept people, as long as there's not nudity involved. We all know what nudity is. We all know what lewdness is. We all know what crudeness is. So, if you think you can abide by a few very simple, civilized rules, you may be allowed up here.
If not, we'll just continue absorbing as we shall.
Have you ever stopped and wondered how many dimensions there are in Dragon Ball Super? Did you know there are 18 universes, and now that we make this video, before the 12 hours over, there are 12 universes. And we also know that there is a heaven, there is a hell, and there is a hyperbolic time chamber. But those are not dimensions, those are actually realms, which we'll talk about in a different video. So, using string theory, we have discovered that there are actually 10 different dimensions in Dragon Ball Super. We're going to break down each dimension and also talk about some of the characters and how powerful they truly are, because some of them are actually above a dimension. So, hola mi gente, my name is Mike Senpai. Welcome to Dragon Ball, where we take real life science and try to figure out what in the world is going on in Dragon Ball Super. We're going to break down some of the biggest mysteries of the show using science, starting with the 10 dimensions. So, according to string theory, all matter is composed of one-dimensional strings. There are about 10 to the power of -33 centimeters in size. Now, that seems like a random number to you, but if you actually stop to think about how small that truly is, that is a million of a billion of a billion of a billion of a centimeter in size. That is ridiculously tiny. So small, in fact, that nothing in the universe can reach that size. So, basically, everything in the universe, all matter.
Please excuse technical difficulties. We are back. We are back. Are we back? Are we back? We're back. I think we are back. I think we are back. Please excuse technical difficulties. I actually think we are back now. We're back up and running. Yes, we are here. That was not a copyright strike. That was a literal somebody tripped over the cord of creation. And you see what happens. Hello, Alley Cat. Yes. Someone tripped over the cord of creation, so suddenly the entire simulation exploded. So, back to the show.
Have you ever stopped and wondered how many dimensions there are in Dragon Ball Super? Because you know that there used to be 18 universes, and now at the making of this video, before the 12 hours over, there are 12 universes. And we also know that there is heaven,
Well, I apologize. Also, public domain. Once again, public domain.
some of them are actually above a dimension. So, hola mi gente, my name is Mike Senpai. Welcome to Dragon Ball, where we take real life science and try to figure out what in the world is going on in Dragon Ball Super. We're going to break down some of the biggest mysteries of the show using science, starting
Okay. Who keeps on tripping on the cord of creation? That's not funny, and it's not humorous.
Oh, sheeple try to tell you what you cannot do. Well, friend, I'm here to let you know you can tell them all get screwed. And when they laugh and they ridicule, throwing words of hate, I remember I'd rather be what my mind sees, because they ain't all that great. Don't let them. Cards with no vision, they just can't seem to see what it takes to be as great as folks like you and me. And if you know deep down that the woman's a mass, but they say that you ain't that great, just take some time to live in your mind. It's the country's freest state. Don't let them bastards keep you down. Don't let them bastards keep you down. Oh, cause all you got to do is simply smile and say, fuck you. All you got to do, simply smile and say, fuck you. Fucktardic shits repressed with the heads up the ass and hypocritical two-faced noobs. The combined IQ of a teenage dude when confronted with his first pair of boobs. It's true, I pray, fuck you at the Temple of Ruth. But to balance the whole thing out, I reach down to my ass, grab a big old laugh, and then follow it up when I shout, don't let them bastards keep you down. Don't let them bastards keep you down. Whoa, cause all you got to do is simply smile and say, fuck you. All you got to do is simply smile and say, fuck you. Oh, sheep will try to tell you what you cannot do. Well, friend, I'm here to let you know you can tell them all get screwed. And they laugh and they ridicule, throwing words of hate. I remember I'd rather be what my mind sees, cause they ain't all that great. Don't let them bastards keep you down. Don't let them bastards keep when they laugh and they ridicule, throwing words of hate. I remember I'd rather be what my mind sees, cause they ain't all that great. Don't let them bastards keep you down. Don't let them bastards keep you down. All that I have to do, simply smile and say, fuck you. All you got to do is Simply smile and say all you got to do. Simply smile and say all you got to do. Simply smile and say, fuck you! Fuck you!
Have you ever stopped and wondered how many dimensions there are in Dragon Ball Super? Of course, you know that there used to be 18 universes, and now at the making of this video, before the Tournament of Power is over, there are 12 universes. And we also know that there is a heaven, there is a hell, and there is the hyperbolic time chamber. But those are not dimensions. Those are actually realms, which we'll talk about in a different video. So, using string theory, we have discovered that there are actually 10 different dimensions in Dragon Ball Super, and we're going to break down each dimension and also talk about some of the characters and how powerful they truly are, because some of them are actually above a dimension. So, hola mi gente, my name is Oppai Senpai. Welcome to Dragon Ball Science, where we take real life science and try to figure out what in the world is going on in Dragon Ball Super. We're going to break down some of the biggest mysteries of the show using science, starting with the 10 dimensions. So, according to string theory, all matter is composed of one-dimensional strings that are about 10 to the power of negative 33 centimeters in size. Now, that seems like a random number to you, but if you actually stop and think about how small that truly is, that is a millionth of a billionth of a billionth of a millionth of a centimeter in size. That is ridiculously tiny. So small, in fact, that nothing in the universe can reach that size. So, basically, everything in the universe, all matter, is composed of this one-dimensional strings that create everything else. Now, according to superstring theory, there are actually 10 different dimensions, and we're going to break all of them down. Starting with this point. At this point, there is really nothing. You can actually consider this the zero dimension, although having zero dimensions is the same thing as saying that nothing exists. So, we're going to actually create a second point and connect it via a straight line. Now we have length. This is the first dimension, but it doesn't really look like anything. So we're actually going to add a third point and give it some height. This is the second dimension, and now starting to look like Goku, but it doesn't quite look like the Goku from the anime or even from Dragon Ball Xenoverse. So we're gonna add some depth to this, and that is the third dimension. The third dimension is actually the space that we occupy right now, and also in the anime, Dragon Ball, and in the manga. However, a little fun fact is that you can't actually see the third dimension. We actually experience it, and we actually live inside the third dimension. But because it takes time for light to travel from point A to point B, it is not visible to us. Even if it's only a millionth of a millionth of a millionth of a second, that duration for light to travel from one point to the other is still time. So the only way for us to truly see the third dimension is to go to the fourth dimension and look below the third dimension. Now, what is the fourth dimension in Dragon Ball Super? Let's use Goku for this example. Many theoretical physicists will tell you that the fourth dimension is basically taking the first three dimensions, which are spatial dimensions, and then adding a factor of time into that. And at a basic level, that does make sense, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Now, in the fourth dimension, if Goku was to look behind him, he will actually see previous versions of himself from the past. So pretty much looking into the past. If he looks in front of him, he will see all the future versions of himself all the way up to his death. That is the fourth dimension. However, the fourth dimension is not a straight line because time, as proven in Dragon Ball Super and as proven in the real world, time is not a constant. Time can be stretched, compressed, it can be sped up, it can be slowed down, it can be even affected by gravity. And therefore, if you were looking at a fourth-dimensional space, it wouldn't look like a straight line, but more, it would look like a spine, kind of curving and turning just slightly. That is what the fourth dimensional would look like. And it is also represented by a tesseract hypercube, which is just a concept that we're not gonna get too much into that. In terms of characters who are fourth-dimensional, we can talk about Whis and Vados as examples. Now, they are three-dimensional beings. However, their staff has four-dimensional powers. Through their staff, they can actually go back and see in the past. They can go back and see a previous Earth version of their current Earth or of the past, something that happened in the past that wasn't being recorded, but they have access to it. And what about Future Trunks? Does Future Trunks have the powers of the fourth dimension? Well, actually, Future Trunks goes even a level above that into the fifth dimension. In the fifth dimension, let's say the fourth dimension, you look behind you, you see previous versions of yourself. You look in front of you, you see future versions of yourself. But what if you were to look to the right or to the left? That is the fifth dimension. In the fifth dimension, you'll be able to see slightly different versions of your timeline. So in the sense of Goku, if you look to the right, you might see a Goku that died from a heart attack. Or if you look to the left, you might see a Goku that turned into Goku Black. That is the fifth dimension. You can pretty much branch out to the left and the right with slightly different variations of your own timeline. Future Trunks is able to take advantage of this with his time machine. His time machine allows him to use the fifth dimension to travel to the fourth dimension back in time. But wait a second, Oppai Senpai, according to Whis has stated that other timelines do not exist until you go back into the past, and that triggers a new timeline and also triggers the time ring. Well, I'm here to tell you guys that Whis is wrong. Whis is a third dimensional being and he doesn't have the perception of the fifth dimension. Therefore, he doesn't truly understand that timeline, that Future Trunks traveled back into time and created a brand new timeline, that timeline actually was already there, even before Future Trunks went to it. The only difference is that because Future Trunks was able to go back in time, he has now created almost like a wormhole that connects his timeline into the one from the past. And that is why you have a time ring, because the time ring is basically a tether between two different timelines in space-time. However, those timelines have already existed, but now we are able to access it thanks to those time rings and that tether, that connection. But now you're probably thinking, if Future Trunks can travel into the past and go to a slightly different timeline, why doesn't he go to, let's say, the timeline of Dragon Ball GT? Well, because Dragon Ball GT doesn't actually exist in the fourth or the fifth dimension. That is actually part of the sixth dimension. Now, going back to the fourth dimension, you look behind you, you see previous versions of yourself in front of you, you see future versions of yourself like Goku. If you look left and right, that is the fifth dimension, slightly different variations of your timeline. But in the sixth dimension, you can also look on top of you, below you, and pretty much any direction where there are very different variations of your timeline, even timelines where you may not even exist. So that is the sixth dimension. Dragon Ball GT exists within the sixth dimension. It is completely different from Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball, and Dragon Ball Super. And that is why no matter how hard Future Trunks tries or Bulma tries with their time machine, they are not able to cross the fifth dimension into the sixth dimension, and they're not even able to travel to Dragon Ball GT. That is part of the sixth dimension, completely different, out of their reach. Woo, man, that was tough. But now we still have four dimensions to talk about, which is why we're gonna take this moment to tell you guys that if you haven't already done so, make sure you guys subscribe to this channel because I've been away for over a month. And because of that, YouTube has number 2, Dragon Ball Science. YouTube. and get in the habit of dimension. Now, in the 7th dimension, daily basis, okay? That way you live reactions every time. Let's get into dimension number 7, the 7th dimension. Now, in the 7th dimension, you have to take all the previous dimensions from 6 all the way down to 1 and compress it into one point, and then connect that point to another point. That is the 7th dimension, where you can basically connect your universe to a different universe that's a little bit different than yours. And in the sense of Dragon Ball Super, we actually see that right now, because you can actually see universe 7, universe 5, universe 4. Those are all part of the 7th dimension, where the universes are slightly different. They may even have slightly different starting conditions and may have different endings, but are still similar enough where it's not too much different from your own universe. And that is the 7th dimension in Dragon Ball Super. The 18 universes or 12 universes that we have, that is the 7th dimension. And here's some examples of 7th dimensional beings. Whis, Vados, all the angels are able to traverse through these 12 universes, and that is why they are to a certain degree part of the 7th dimension in terms of their power. But if we go into the 8th dimension, now here is where things get really interesting, because in the 8th dimensions, not only are you able to travel between these 12, 18 universes, but you can actually travel between every possible world and universe, even if they have different starting conditions, that branches out infinitely. But you can also travel between every possible universe that is out there. And one of these examples is Dr. Slump. Dr. Slump is a universe that is very different from ours. It is very similar in some ways, but different in others. In fact, some of the laws of physics are actually different in this universe. But because this universe exists within the 8th dimension, our characters are not able to easily access the Dr. Slump universe. Now, we have seen in both Dr. Slump and Dragon Ball Super, that they're having crossovers. But that is because of the 10th dimension that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But in terms of the 8th dimension, Dr. Slump exists within the 8th dimension, and our characters cannot easily access that. Now, if we go into the 9th dimension, the 9th dimension basically branches out infinitely for different universes that have different starting points and different endings, and even have different laws of physics and laws of nature. So it's almost like the 4th, 5th, and 6th dimension, where the 7th dimension you have almost like a straight line. The 8th dimension you can branch out left to right, but in the 9th dimension you can branch out infinitely to every direction, but with different universes with different possibilities, ending, starting points, and laws of physics. So that is the 9th dimension. If we go into the 10th dimension, this is where everything exists. The 10th dimension basically compresses all previous 9 dimensions into one point, and the 10th dimension is basically infinite possibilities of everything. Everything exists within the 10th dimension. According to string theory, superstrings vibrating in the 10th dimension is what creates the subatomic particles that make up our universe and every single universe of the multiverse. Now, in terms of which characters exist within the 10th dimension,
Clearly, they're merely talking about the upper 4 circles whenever they go to the 10th dimension, and they will go a hair farther, which means they merely go to that center bottom portion. This is a representation of the 12th dimension, and this is a representation of the 9th dimension. Continue. As well as public domain, public domain.
Zeno-sama doesn't, because Zeno-sama is the different versions of him from different timelines. Now, what about the Super Dragon Balls? My prediction is that the Super Dragon Balls, Super Shenron, and even the creator of the Super Dragon Balls, Zalama, they are limited by the 8th dimension. At most, you may be able to go into the 9th dimension with the Super Dragon Balls if you were to wish to go into a completely different universe with completely different physics. The Super Dragon Balls may be able to do that at most, but I predict it's more of the 8th dimension. In the 10th dimension, there is only one character that exists in the 10th dimension, and it is Narubai Senpai, although sometimes I think it is. But the only character in Dragon Ball, in the Dragon Ball franchise, that exists in the 10th dimension is Toribot. Toribot is a character of infinite possibilities. He is almost like the writer of the show, but in the show. So he exists within the 10th dimension, and he oversees everything below that, all the other 9 dimensions. And that's how Toribot is able to easily cross between the manga and the different animes at any time that he wants, and the other characters are not aware of his presence, because Toribot exists within the 10th dimension of infinite possibilities of everything. And these are the 10 dimensions of Dragon Ball Super, as proven by string theory in the real world. So what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with string theory on the 10 dimensions and the dimensions of Dragon Ball Super, or do you have some other ideas? Let me know in the comments below, but also let me know what other videos you want me to do with Dragon Ball science. What do you want science to explain? What mysteries do you want to be revealed in Dragon Ball Super? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll be working on a second video in the upcoming days, the second episode of Dragon Ball Science. Thank you guys for watching.
Hello, everybody. So, we are here. We are rolling. We're rolling. We're just here existing. Is there anybody out there? I don't think there's anybody out there. Nobody's out there. Not even nobody's out there. As we sit here, I think this may have been an excellent show. I'll round it around. Oh, hello, person who just walks through the door. Hello, person who just walks through the door. How are you? How are you? You are the reason the show has extended. Oh, maybe not. We got 15 seconds before I decide to wrap it up. If there is no more participants, 10 seconds. Nothing. Nobody. Only no one. Only no one exists here. Is there anybody out there? Guess not. Good show. Good show. Public domain. Thank you.